He sat 12 feet from my desk. He knew my coffee order, the name of my cat, the date my husband died, because he had sent flowers. When I figured out what he had been doing for 2 years, I said nothing. I kept smiling. I kept saying good morning. And for 91 days while he watched me, I built something he never saw coming. My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 63 years old, and this is my true story from Portland, Oregon. Ray died 22 months before any of this happened. Brain aneurysm. He was standing in the kitchen making eggs on a Sunday morning, and then he wasn't standing anymore. 31 years of marriage ended between one breath and the next. He was a quiet man, Ray, a careful man. He spent his career as a civil engineer checking other people's calculations because he believed that small errors left uncorrected eventually become catastrophes. He was right about that. I just didn't know yet how right. When he died, I discovered the particular arithmetic of grief. The mortgage stays the same. The utilities stay the same. The property taxes don't care that you're suddenly alone. I was 61 years old, and retirement was not a number I could reach anymore, not without selling the house, and the house was the one thing I intended to keep. I had worked for 17 years as a legal assistant at Harmon and Price, a mid-sized firm in downtown Portland that specialized in estate planning and probate law. Wills, trust, inheritance disputes, the careful unwinding of lives after people died. I knew the work well. I was good at it. And after Ray died, I understood it differently than I ever had before. The early morning bus had become unreliable in my neighborhood. Route changes reduced service, the usual story. My daughter in Seattle worried about me standing alone at stops in the dark. So I downloaded the rideshare app the way people eventually do all the things they said they wouldn't. That is how I met Curtis. The first morning, I almost didn't get in. He was a large man, completely bald, mid-50s, with the kind of stillness that could read two different ways depending on who you were. I checked his rating. 463 rides, 5 stars. I got in. He said good morning. That was all. We drove 14 minutes to my office building in silence. And when he pulled up, he said, "Have a good day," and nothing else. I told my daughter about him that evening. She said he sounded like he could be dangerous. I said he sounded like a man who had learned that most conversation is optional. She wasn't entirely wrong. Neither was I. Over the following weeks, Curtis was almost always the driver who accepted my early fare. Same dark streets, same quiet car, same deliberate calm. I learned things about him the way you learn things about a private person, not from what they say, but from what they carry. A worn Bible on the passenger seat he touched, but never opened before starting the engine. A physical therapy reminder card tucked in the sun visor. A photograph on the dashboard, him younger. A woman beside him. A teenage boy, all three laughing at something outside the frame. One morning, I brought him coffee. Dark roast, no sugar, because I didn't know how he took it, and I wasn't going to ask and make it complicated. He looked at the cup and said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I make too much." He accepted it without further discussion. It became a routine. 4:15 a.m., pour the coffee cap, the green lid, hand it through the seat gap when he pulls up. He always said thank you. Never once made it into a thing. What Curtis did not know, what nobody at that point knew, was that I had already been quietly falling apart for 3 months, inside a problem I hadn't told anyone about. Now let me tell you about Harmon and Price, and let me tell you about a man named Glenn Strictly. Glenn had been the senior paralegal at the firm for 11 years. He sat 12 feet from my desk. He knew my coffee order, the name of my cat, and the date of Ray's death because he had sent flowers. He was organized, competent, well-liked by the partners, and somewhere in the 2 years before I started paying attention, he had begun quietly stealing from the dead. Probate work involves money that is temporarily without a guardian. Estates in process. Accounts being dissolved, assets being transferred, funds, waiting for distribution to beneficiaries who often don't know exactly what they should be receiving. Glenn had found in the gap between what the system showed and what clients were told, a place where numbers could be adjusted without anyone looking closely. Small amounts, adjusted valuation here, delayed disbursement there, not enough to trigger an audit, not enough for any single family to notice when they were already exhausted from grief and paperwork and just wanting it to be finished. He had been doing it for at least 2 years by the time I started noticing the numbers didn't quite breathe right. I noticed in January a trust disbursement for an elderly widow in Beaverton. The accounting was clean, but the timeline was wrong. I went back through her file, and then I went back through 6 other files from the same period, and by February, I understood what I was looking at. And here is the part I need you to understand. I did not go to the partners, not yet, because Glenn was trusted, because I was the dead man's wife, still raw, still adjusting, and I knew exactly how that looked. A grieving woman alone, 62 years old, pointing a finger at the firm's senior paralegal, with nothing yet but a feeling and a few spreadsheets that required explanation. So I kept coming to work. I kept saying good morning to Glenn. I kept accepting the coffee he sometimes brought the office on Fridays. And every week quietly, I built the file. I made copies at home, not on firm equipment. A small printer Ray had used for his engineering documents still sitting in the second bedroom. I cross-referenced disbursement records against county probate filings, which are public. I created a timeline. I kept everything in a locked box in the bottom of my winter coat closet because it was the last place anyone would think to look for documents in Portland in February. 3 months. I said nothing to anyone. What I did not know during those 3 months was that Glenn had noticed me noticing. Not right away, but by March he had started watching. And somewhere in that watching, he had decided I was a problem that needed to be resolved before I resolved him. Curtis picked up on something before I did. Not the specifics, just the texture of something wrong. He told me later that in late March he had driven a man home from a bar on Thursday night, a man who talked on the phone the entire ride, not loudly but clearly the way people do when they consider a car to be empty. The man talked about a woman at work who had been pulling files she had no reason to pull. A woman who had recently started coming in on Saturday mornings when the office was closed. A woman who had become, as he put it, a loose end. Curtis did not yet know that woman was me. But he remembered the downtown office building where he dropped me every weekday at 6:15 a.m. And the description the man gave a woman in her early 60s works. The front section near the windows was specific enough to make him quiet for the rest of that drive. He started asking me small questions. Careful ones dropped at the end of rides. Did our office handle estate accounts still in probate? I said yes, a lot of them. He asked if I ever took paperwork home. I said sometimes general research, nothing client specific. He nodded slowly. Then one morning he asked, "Do you feel safe at work?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was watching the road. His hands were relaxed on the wheel, but his jaw was set. I said, "That's a specific question." He said, "I heard something. I'm not sure yet what it means." And that was the morning I made a decision. I looked at this man I had been riding with for 4 months. This man with the photograph on his dashboard and the Bible he touched every morning, and I said, "I need to tell you something." And I told him everything. The files, the timeline, the locked box in the closet, Glenn's name, all of it. He was quiet for the full last 3 blocks to my building. When he pulled up, he said, "How long have you been doing this alone?" I said 91 days. He nodded once. He said, "You are going to need a witness." I said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." Curtis, as it turned out, had his own reason for understanding exactly what I was doing and exactly why it mattered to do it right. He told me that 7 years earlier, he had seen something wrong at the warehouse logistics company where he worked as a floor manager. Inventory manipulation, supplier kickbacks. He had reported it through internal channels. The company's response was to document a series of performance issues for him that had not existed the week before, and 6 months later, he was gone. No lawsuit, no record, just gone. So when I told him I had 91 days of documented evidence in a locked box, he understood that I was not being paranoid. I was being methodical, and he understood why I had not told anyone at the firm. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need someone who can corroborate the timeline, someone who has seen my patterns, my hours, the way I've been moving through this from outside." He said, "I can do that." So the morning everything came open was not the morning I found out I was in danger. I already knew that. It was the morning Curtis told me what the Thursday night passenger had said, because now we both understood it was Glenn, and now we both understood the timeline had shortened. He didn't miss my stop. He drove me somewhere quiet. A parking structure 2 blocks east turned off the engine and said he mentioned your name last night. Directly? He said he needed the situation handled before the end of the month. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said I have an appointment with the Oregon State Bar's ethics hotline at 10 a.m. I made it last week. I just needed to tell you first. Curtis looked at me. He said, "You already called them." I said I called them 17 days ago. They've been expecting the documentation. I'm delivering it this morning. He was quiet. Then something moved through his face that I can only describe as relief mixed with something older than that. He drove me to the office. I went upstairs, retrieved the copies I had stored in a locked drawer. I alone had the key to place them in the bag I had prepared, and took a car to the State Bar's Portland office. By 2 that afternoon, the firm's managing partner had been contacted. By the following morning, a forensic accountant had been retained. Glenn Strictly was placed on administrative leave within 72 hours. His access to all firm systems was revoked before he returned from lunch. The investigation took 4 months. The total amount redirected from estate accounts was $312,000, drawn across 21 client files over 26 months. All of it was documented in the file I had built between January and April, 91 days of Saturday mornings and late evenings at a Ray's old printer in the second bedroom. Glenn's attorney argued the evidence had been improperly gathered. The State Bar disagreed. Curtis gave a statement about the Thursday night ride and 2 subsequent ones where Glenn had discussed the quote-unquote situation at his office. Those statements established that Glenn knew he was being watched and had discussed with an unnamed third party the need to handle it before anyone could go external. He was disbarred from a paralegal practice and charged with felony theft by deception. He pled guilty to reduced charges and received 18 months plus full restitution. The families were notified. Most of them were elderly or the adult children of people who had died. Several of them sent letters to the firm. One woman whose mother's estate had been shorted $11,000 sent a letter directly to me. She said she had always believed something was wrong, but didn't know how to say it, and that knowing someone had seen it and done something about it quietly without drama, without making the family go through more than they already had, meant more than she could say. I kept that letter. It's in the same box where the evidence used to be. Curtis and I still meet for coffee on Sunday mornings. Now actual sit-down coffee at a diner, 3 blocks from his mother's house, where he takes her to church afterward. He introduced me to her in June. She held my hand for a long time and said Ray was a lucky man. I told her I was the lucky one. What Curtis told me weeks after everything was over was that the reason he'd started asking me quiet questions back in March was not just the passenger he overheard. It was the photograph on my face. He said I looked every single morning like a person who was carrying something they had decided to carry alone, and he recognized that look because he had worn it for years after the logistics company, and he had never wanted to see it on someone else without saying something. He said I didn't know what you were dealing with. I just knew you were dealing with something. I said, "How did you know I wasn't going to fall apart?" He thought about it for a second. He said, "Because you kept bringing the coffee." I've thought about that a lot since. I am 63 years old. I work fewer hours now, different cases, and I understand estate law in a way that is no longer theoretical for me. Ray left me a small life carefully built, and I intend to keep it. What I want to say to you is this. Strength doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a woman sitting quietly at her desk for 91 days, saying good morning and accepting coffee on Fridays, and building something in the dark that nobody can take apart. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait until you are ready and then not wait a single day longer. And sometimes the person sitting in the front seat of a car at 5 in the morning, the person you almost didn't get into the car with, is the one who sees you carrying it and decides to say something. Here is what I want to ask you. Have you ever stayed quiet about something that was wrong because you were waiting for the right moment or the right proof or just the right person to tell? Leave that in the comments. I mean it. I read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience is not the same as weakness. Subscribe if you want more stories told straight through, no shortcuts, no performance, just the truth of what people carry and what they do with it. I am still here, and that was always the plan.